This chapter is probably the most important and intense chapters of the semester. Most of us have followed the history of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, seeing thousands of veterans come home. We've seen homeless vets with all sorts of injuries. Here we will focus on TBI and PTSD. We will discuss some of the other issues, but that is most of what we will focus on here. TBI refers to traumatic brain injury. It refers to injuries to the head that disrupt brain functioning that affect language, emotions, behavior, and the ability to think and learn. TBI is probably most unique in modern warfare. It has been around for centuries and it occurs in civilian populations as well. What makes it unique in today's combat is the prevalence of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, used against Americans and other forces in the world, especially in the Middle East. About 17% of post 9/11 veterans met the criteria for TBI during their military service. Common causes of TBI include blasts, objects hitting the head, and falls. Males, enlisted personnel, and people exposed to combat are more likely to get TBI than other people. TBI can be mild, moderate, or severe. Severe cases typically show up in an MRI or CT scan or are associated with loss of consciousness and amnesia. Most cases of TBI are mild in nature. Behavioral manifestations of TBI can include impulsiveness and apathy. Cognitive problems may include memory loss, attention problems, and language problems. It is also associated with dementia as veterans age. Trauma has always been an issue. It is associated with any large-scale life event, not just war. However, in war, we have used terms like shell shock in World War I and battle fatigue in World War II. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was first included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, in 1980, when it appeared in the third edition, hence the DSM-3. It was a result of years of work among veterans groups, primarily Vietnam veterans, clinicians, and politicians. The PTSD diagnosis requires exposure to actual or threatening death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Symptoms of PTSD include experiencing the event, avoiding trauma-associated stimuli, and having more negative thoughts and feelings than before the event. Sidebar, I still get a little nervous around enclosed metal objects. Very odd. Anyway, according to one study, as many as 23% of veterans from Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom suffer from PTSD. That exposure is a consistent and most cited predictor of PTSD among veterans. If you do not know it, it is important to know that PTSD is manifested in many different ways. It can lead to depression, anxiety, substance abuse. Often clinicians need to treat the outcomes of PTSD rather than PTSD itself. It should also be pointed out that TBI and PTSD overlap because the causes of TBI are combat related. So experiencing the event that causes TBI is likely to also trigger PTSD. This is called comorbidity in the mental health world. There are also other manifestations of stress among veterans. First, you should be aware that much research shows that veterans typically smoke and drink more than their civilian peers. Men and working class people, civilian and military, are much more likely to have substance abuse problems than their female and middle and upper class peers. This is important because enlisted men make up the majority of the armed services. Much like TBI and PTSD, the prevalence of binge drinking and the use of other drugs increases with exposure to combat. Combat exposure is also associated with risky behaviors including driving while under the influence, violence, and destroying property. Moral injuries are inner conflicts that result from behaving or seeing behaviors that conflict with one's own personal values. It may involve killing, seeing other people commit immoral acts in war, friendly fire, or destroying civilian property. Of course, again, exposure to combat is related here because that is where many of these things happen. Suicide is a tough topic to discuss. I want to say that your book indicates that suicide rates are similar to the general public. See page 206. This is not what you will find if you Google search this issue. Here's a quote from military.com. Quote, the researchers found that from 2006 to 2020, the suicide rate was roughly 42 per 100,000 for veterans versus roughly 18 per 100,000 for the general population when looking at the groups across the 15-year frame. Unquote. It's important to know that, in general, men tend to commit suicide at higher rates than women and have more substance abuse problems, while women tend to suffer more from depression than men. That is only important because men make up 80% of the military, hence you're always going to see some issues in the military more than the general public, which is about 50% female. The concept of grit has taken over a lot of psychology in the last decade. In the military, it has been made famous by a psychologist named Angela Duckworth. She did a study that showed the power of grit in managing life and being a leader. She has strong ties to the military, especially West Point Military Academy. How do you get grit? It is difficult to create scenarios for this. However, it does happen. War, for good or bad, is a place that can produce a scenario where people either suffer or grow stronger. Research actually shows that both can happen at the same time. Someone with PTSD can also see their negative events as an opportunity for growth. Of course, that does not always happen. One study cited in your text showed that veterans experiencing the stresses of war also began to see an increase in the appreciation for life, personal strength, and post-traumatic growth, the ability to manage life's stresses better. Any intense stress can also bring people together, including wartime experiences. Such experiences give people a common bond, a traumatic memory that they share that other people do not have. Well, I don't think anyone believes exposure to harm associated with military service is a good thing. Research does show that humans can find a way to make the most of them and use them for something good, related to the concept of agency from another lecture. In summary, this chapter reviews the impact of war on soldiers' lives. We focused on TBI and PTSD because they're the most common issues that service members deal with when they leave service today. While the bulk of the research and theory in this area focuses on the negative impacts of wartime service, it also shows the resilience some people have in managing these things and even uses them to build lifelong relationships.